The 20th century was a time of boom in America. From the start, the automobile took the industry by storm with companies such as General Motors and Ford. Soon, by the middle to end of the 20th century, the need for information was growing rapidly. The creation of IBM symbolized the beginning of the transition into the information age in America. By the end of the 1990s, technology was soaring. A company called Microsoft quickly dominated the information industry through the accessibility to the public that they provided. Big business drastically changed as a result of the ease of accessible information. Now, around the globe, business networks were communicating with ease. The markets were in full expansion. The expansion of the internet had its perils as well. Many investors were putting too much money into the stocks of the internet. Soon, the internet was not generating enough revenue to be able to support their stock. This caused the stock market crisis of 2000. This was the biggest financial downturn since the Second World War. Countless people who had put great amounts of money into the stocks of these internet companies were drastically losing their investments due to lack of revenue. This event became referred to as when the dot-com bubble burst. The crash of 2000 proved that even in times of business boom, that the U.S. was not immune to these types of crashes happening within the economy. As it is commonly known, by the start of the 20th century, women were fighting for rights. As the 20th century continued, they slowly climbed the ladder of society, establishing a new status, a status of importance and ability. Women all over were determined to change the stereotypical view of a woman's role in the world. Over the next 5 decades, more and more women were a part of the American workforce. By the 1990s, nearly half of the workers in the workforce were women. Even though women were finally being accepted in the work world, feminists still had a battle to fight. Women were being paid less than men, even for doing the same job. In 2002, it was recorded that women earned 70 cents on the dollar in a comparison to a salary of a man. A women's revolution was revived with the beginning of a chance for women to not be relegated to leave the workforce to raise a family. The late 20th century marks as well as a change in American households. Men were beginning to stay home with the children. In 1993, Congress passed the Family Leave Bill to protect families who have children and also working responsibilities. The beginning of the 21st century and all the economic issues that followed showed that America was no longer the wealthiest country in the world. In 2001, rich people made up 20% of the nation's population and nearly half of the nation's income. Beginning in the 1980s, the gap between the rich and the poor began to widen and soon continued into the turn of the century. The Welfare Reform Bill of 1996 was passed by Congress in response to the great numbers of impoverished people. This bill forced able-bodied recipients to go find work. Impoverished people also lacked health care. By 2004, some 40 million people total lived without insurance. The rich dominated the world, and some said it was a result of the Reagan administration and the Bush administration's policies. Also, in the end of the 20th century, following into the 21st century, education was on the rise. Both men and women dominated the workforce with their college educations and their hard work.
By the 1990s, medicine had largely advanced in America. This increased the lifespan of Americans. Due to this increased lifespan, the number of senior citizens increased as well, which increased the percentage of the GNP spent on health care for old people after Medicare was created in 1965. The Social Security system was strained because of the ratio of active workers to retirees had decreased. This led to increased taxes on workers. During this time period, 50% of marriages ended in divorce. Also, by the 1990s, 25% of children grew up in a household that did not consist of 2 parents. The relative number of adults living alone had tripled by the 1990s.
Newcomers continue to flow into modern America. There were nearly 1 million immigrants per year from the 1980s up to the 2000s. This was the largest inflow of immigrants in America's experience. Europe contributed far fewer people than Asia and Latin America. Immigrants began settling in the suburbs of Los Angeles, Dallas, and Atlanta instead of just cities and towns. This was where they found job openings. What prompted new immigration to the U.S.? The truth is that the new immigrants came for many of the same reasons as the old. They typically left countries where population was increasing rapidly and where agricultural and industrial revolutions were shaking people loose of old habits of life. They came to America in search for jobs and economic opportunities. Some came with skills and even professional degrees and found their ways into the middle-class jobs. However, most came with fewer skills, less education. They seek to work as janitors, nannies, farm laborers, lawn cutters, or restaurant workers. The Southwest felt immigration the hardest, since Mexican immigrants concentrated heavily in that region. By the turn of the century, Latinos made up nearly one-third of the population in California, Arizona, Texas, and nearly 40% of New Mexico. Latinos succeeded in making the Southwest a bicultural region by holding onto their culture by strength in numbers, compared to most immigrants whom had learned English ways and language. Some old stock Americans were scared of America's capacity to absorb all of these immigrants. Due to this fear, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 attempted to choke off illegal entry by penalizing employers of undocumented aliens and by granting amnesty of those already here. Anti-immigrant sentiment flared, especially in California, in the wake of economic recession in the early 1990s. California voters approved a ballot initiative that attempted to deny benefits, including education, to illegal immigrants. This was later struck down by the courts. States then passed another law in 1998 which put an end to bilingual teaching in state schools. Only 11.5% of foreign-born people accounted for the U.S. population in 2002. This was smaller than the 15% in 1910. Evidence, nonetheless, still showed that U.S. welcomed and needed immigrants. The bad side was immigrants robbed citizens of jobs and dumped themselves on welfare rolls at the taxpayers' expense. The good side was immigrants took jobs that Americans didn't want. Infusion of young immigrants and their offsprings counterbalanced the overwhelming rate of an aging population. Thanks to their increasing immigration and high birth rate, Latinos were becoming an increasingly important minority. By 2003, the U.S. was home to about 39 million of them. 26 million Chicanos, or Mexican Americans, resided in the Southwest. 3 million Puerto Ricans resided in the Northeast, and 1 million Cubans resided in Florida. Latinos also became involved in political powers when they elected the mayor of Miami, Denver, and San Antonio. After many years of struggle, the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, headed by Cesar Chavez, succeeded in making working conditions better for Chicano stoop laborers who followed the planting cycle of the American West. Latino influence seemed likely to grow. Latinos, confident and well-organized, became the nation's largest ethnic minority. It outnumbered African Americans in 2003. California was a patchwork of minorities with no single ethnic majority. In 2003, most newborns in California were Latino. Asian Americans also made great strides. By the 1980s, they were America's fastest-growing minority, and their numbers reached to about 12 million by 2003. Citizens of Asian ancestry were now counted among the most prosperous. In 2003, the average Asian household was 25% better off than that of an average white household. Indians, the original Americans, numbered some 2.4 million in 2000. Half had left their reservations to live in cities. Unemployment and alcoholism had blighted reservation life. Many tribes took advantage of their special legal status of independence by opening up casinos on reservations to the public. However, discrimination and poverty proved hard to break. Cities grew less safe. Crime was the great scourge of urban life. The rate of violent crimes reached an all-time high in the drug-infested 80s, but then leveled out in the 90s. The number of violent crimes substantially dropped in many areas after 1995. Nonetheless, murders, robberies, and rapes remained common in cities and rural areas and the suburbs. America imprisoned a larger fraction of its citizens than almost any other country in the world, and some desperate citizens resorted to armed pillage and tactics to protect themselves. In the mid-1990s, a swift and massive transition took place from cities to suburbs, making jobs suburbanized. The nation's brief urban age lasted for only a little less than 7 decades, and with it, Americans noticed a new form of isolationism. Some suburban neighborhoods stayed secluded by staying locked in gated communities. By the first decade of the 21st century, big suburban rings around cities like New York, Chicago, Houston, and Washington, D.C. had become more racially and ethnically diverse, their individual schools and towns were often homogeneous. Suburbs grew fastest in the west and southwest. In the outer orbits of Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, and Phoenix, builders of roads, water mains, and schools could barely keep up with the new towns sprouting across the landscape. Newcomers came not only from the nearby cities, but from other regions of the United States as well. A huge shift of U.S. population was underway from the Northeast and Midwest to South and West to job opportunities and sun. The Great Plains, hurt from the 60% decline of all counties, resulted in losing population. This was a hollowing out of the traditional American heartland. By early 21st century, Great Plains contained fewer people than the Los Angeles basin, despite being 5 times the size of the entire state of California. However, some cities showed signs of renewal. Commercial redevelopment gained ground in cities such as New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, and San Francisco. Well-to-do residents reclaimed once fashionable neighborhoods and sent real estate's values soaring, but these urban homesteaders struggled to make their cities genuine centers of residential integration. Cities stubbornly remained as divided by wealth and race as the suburban social landscape surrounding them. America witnessed harsh racial and ethnic tensions that exacerbated the problems of American cities, especially in Los Angeles when in 1992 a mostly white jury exonerated white Los Angeles police officers who had been videotaped violently beating a black suspect. This triggered rage, which led to arson, attacks, and even deaths.
It spread, and that his officers were overwhelmed at times and retreated. Drivers were dragged from their cars and beaten near the intersection of Florence and Normandy. At one point, 2 cars collided trying to race through that intersection.
Just 3 years later, again in Los Angeles, the former football star O.J. Simpson was arrested for the murders of his former wife and another victim. All evidence seemed to point to Simpson's guilt, but the jury acquitted him, presumably because the police officers involved in the case were shown to be racist. In a later civil trial, another jury unanimously found Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of his victims. By the late 20th century, minorities made up a majority of the population of many American cities. In 2002, 52% of blacks and only 21% of whites lived in inner cities. Blacks who'd benefited from the civil rights movement fled to the suburbs along with whites, leaving the poorer black ghettos behind. Without a middle class to help the community, the cities became plagued by unemployment, crime, and drug addictions. By the early 21st century, blacks dramatically advanced into higher education, but the educational gap between blacks and whites remained. In 2003, affirmative action gained a victory when the Supreme Court, in a key case involving the University of Michigan, affirmed that achieving racial diversity on college campuses was a legitimate means to secure a more equitable society. Ethnic pride soon became the catchphrase as more immigrants streamed into the country eager to succeed without forfeiting their cultural inheritance. Also, by the late 20th century, many intellectuals embraced the creed of multiculturalism, which stressed the need to preserve and promote a variety of ethnic and racial cultures. The Census Bureau stimulated the continuous controversial debate when in 2000 it allowed respondents to identify themselves with more than one of the 6 standard racial categories: Black, White, Latino, American Indian, Asian, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. Americans in the early 21st century read more, listened to more music, and were better educated than ever before. 2.5 million college degrees were awarded in 2004, and 1 in every 4 25 to 34-year-old was a college graduate. This expanding mass of educated people lifted the economy. The rise of authors from different ethnic groups reflected much about the state of American society in the new century. Larry McMurtry was an American author who wrote about life in the West in Lonesome Dove. Alice Walker was an African-American author who gave fictional voice to the experiences of black women in The Color Purple. Edward P. Jones rendered the life of a slave-owning black family in the known world. Scott Mama Day was a Native American author who portrayed Indian life in Housemaid of Dawn. Sandra Cisneros wrote about her life as a Mexican-American kid to evoke Latino life in the working-class Chicago in the house on Mango Street. Asian American authors flourished. Among them was playwright David Huang, novelist Amy Tan, and essayist Maxine Hong Kingston. Beginning with the post-war abstract expressionist movement in New York City, American visual arts and architecture also led worldwide revolutions in taste and transformed the nature of urban life.
The American spirit pulsed with vitality in the early 21st century, but grave problems continued to plague the Republic. Women fell short of first-class citizenship. American society had to adapt to the new realities of women's work outside the home of the traditional family. Many Americans of color still dreamed of full equality, and powerful foreign competitors challenged America's economic status. Environmental worries clouded the country's future. Coal-fired electrical generating plants helped form acid rain, which contributed to the greenhouse effect. Radioactive waste disposal delayed the development of nuclear power plants, and the planet was being drained of oil, and disastrous accidents like the grounding and subsequent oil spill of Exxon Valdez in 1989 in Alaska demonstrated ecological risks of oil exploration and transportation at sea. By the early 21st century, alternative fuel sources fascinated the public with solar power and windmills, methane fuel, electric hybrid cars, and the pursuit of an affordable hydrogen fuel cell. New doors were opening for the U.S. people, including opportunities in outer space and inner-city streets, artist's easel and the musician's concert hall, at the inventor's bench and the scientist's laboratory, and the unending quest for social justice, individual fulfillment, and international peace. The terrorist attack on America on September 11, 2001 posed yet another challenge to the United States that now had to preserve its security without altering its democratic values. The great danger of terrorism was not al-Qaeda. It was rather that in fighting terrorism, Americans would compromise their freedoms at home and isolate the country internationally. Born as a revolutionary force in the world of conservatism, the United States stood in the 21st century as a conservative force in a world of revolution.